Welcome back, everybody, to another shockingly gruesome episode of Lockdown 23 and 1. It is very early in the morning, and we're about to go down what I guess you can consider a Halloween story session for the record books. Prison homicide. That's right, inmate on inmate violence. This story is probably one of the most treacherous ones I've ever heard. Coming from Florida about an inmate named Ricky Martin, as well as an inmate by the name of Mr. Rogers. We're going to talk a little bit about them and their early life before prison, as well as some of their in-house infractions that they gathered until this crazy moment happened. So, if this is what you're into, all things lockup and crime related, then this is where you want to be. Hit that like, subscribe, notification bell before you leave, and check out my playlist with many more videos for y'all to start watching today. One more thing before we get into the story I'd like to hear y'all's input on. There's a lot of people I see in the comment section saying, do an interview with this guy, do an interview with that guy. I've already done interviews with them. So that just goes to show me that a lot of people haven't seen my old content, especially my interviews. So I'm going to start uploading some highlight episodes or maybe shorts. I'm not quite sure exactly how I'm going to do it. And of course, if you enjoy the highlight, I'm going to have the full video linked with it. So let me know. Is that something y'all might be interested in? Either way, new content will never stop rolling, and I'm always on the lookout for a good interview. So if you got a story to tell, come my way. Hit me up on Instagram. Links in the description of the video. Now let's get into one of the craziest Florida prison stories I've ever heard. And there's a lot of them, man. There's a lot of them. Let's start off with Mr. Ricky Martin. He was convicted of burglary in Naples and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. But first, let's talk a little bit about who he was before he got locked up. Mr. Ricky Martin, who had 2 small daughters, was born in Ohio. Family members said that when he was 2 years old, his parents were murdered in the town of Brownsville. That's sad. Sounds kind of like the start of a Batman movie. Bruce Wayne's parents were robbed and killed when he was young. He and his sisters were sent to live with their grandparents in Naples. Martin loved his grandmother but had a difficult time getting along with his grandfather. Ricky was on the small side and kept getting into scraps with bigger bullies who picked on him. He turned to the streets as a cry for help, said his childhood friend Quentin Mathis, explaining that Martin joined street gangs for protection. He felt like he was alone and they gave him hope. Despite his gang involvement, Martin never did anything violent. Most of his crimes were petty, such as stealing his uncle's car and taking it for a joyride. He had a learning disorder and had difficulty in school. His prison record shows that he had been a special education student who was about 3 years below grade level. It was hard for him to keep a job since he had mental capacity of someone a lot younger than his age, his family said. Basically, he couldn't pay his rent, and the bottom line is he went out and did stupid things. With the birth of his second daughter early in his term, he came to realize that he had more to hope for and began to distance himself from the gangs, his family and best friends said. Probably because he was keeping in contact with them over the phone and whatnot. But look, man, I don't know what y'all heard about gangs, but even when I was younger, I always knew that, usually when you join something like that, it's for life. And you better be ready to do some crazy wild stuff for that organization, man. If not, then you could get turned on within an instant. So my 2 cents to y'all is don't join a gang. But one of the situations that had him turn away from the gang activity, not to mention he had a kid on the way, or a kid that was just born, his second daughter, he said that the gang wanted him to stab a blood in the chow hall, but told them, no, I want it out. I got 2 kids and a wife, and that gang stuff is not worth losing my life over. And that's the story of a lot of inmates. He ain't alone in that department. Martin wrote in a 2009 grievance asking the Inspector General to place him in protective management because he feared the gang would kill him. And I'm not quite sure what the Inspector General is, man. Is that some kind of special branch that Florida has for kind of like a checks and balances against the staff and the warden? I'm not sure. I've never heard that term except for what's on the back of my cigarette box. Surgeon General, that's what it is, I think, not inspector. But Martin's wife said her husband was looking forward to his release and to being a father to his daughters, whom he'd seen only a few times, but he suspected that the correctional officers had it out for him because they kept moving him farther and farther away from his home. In one grievance, Martin wrote to the Inspector General. He said that he was purposely trying to get in trouble so he would remain in disciplinary confinement. And I've told many stories about people doing that. They'll attack a guard real quick, but some of these prisons, you attack a guard, man, you're going to be in way worse of a situation than what you began with, because the guards are dirtier than the inmates, especially in Florida, if you were to ask me, at least from what I heard. Mr. Ricky thought he'd be safer in confinement rather than in general population. Ricky was known to cut himself as well. It would help him stay back there in the confinement, keep him away from GP a little bit longer. He was just trying to get by until he got out, his wife said. He wanted to come home, get a job, and live his life. Now, let's talk about the other inmate, his future cellmate, Mr. Rogers. Mr. Jiggaman Rogers is what they called him in prison, and this is his history of violence within the institution. Doesn't go into his youth or anything like that, but you can get a good sense of what kind of cellmate he was going to have when he walked in. It was close to midnight when corrections officers found inmate Noah Stancil beaten in a pool of blood, unconscious, in a cell at Santa Rosa Correctional Facility. Stancil was hogtied, his arms and legs behind him. His cellmate Sean Rogers was covered in blood. "I done what I done," Rogers told officers, admitting that he jumped Stancil from behind, tied him up, beat him with a food tray, and got a few kicks in before the officers came. I mean, I really want y'all to put yourself in this position, man, in a prison, and you're in a cell with someone that you don't know for the first time. A few of these people, man, you always got to be on guard. It doesn't matter if they seem or look friendly, talking nice and polite and whatever, you can't trust nobody. It's prison, man, so that means everyone in there did something bad, some way worse than others to get there, so always remember that if you take that dark path. Rogers is serving a life sentence for armed robbery and aggravated battery. He was returned to disciplinary confinement on charges of assault and battery, failure to comply, and inciting a riot. He was then transferred to a Florida state prison, which houses the state's death row inmates. Over the next several years, he racked up dozens of violations, including repeated assaults on inmates. He started tampering with prison sprinkler devices, breaking them on a regular basis, which causes the cell block or cell to flood. When he threatened staff, which he did often, he said on more than one occasion, "I have 2 life sentences. You can't do shit to stop me." He was disciplined for exposing himself to inmates and staff, threatening staff and inmates, and for fighting. In 2009, while at Florida State Prison in a mental health waiting area, Mr. Rogers brandished an ice-pick tool and stabbed inmate Ronald Whitcliffe repeatedly in the head. Whitcliffe was hospitalized and Rogers was later transferred to Union Correctional. 1 month later, Rogers returned to disciplinary confinement again, assaulted another inmate, this time by kneeing him in the head. Upon his return to Florida State Prison in 2011, Rogers' assault spree continued, records show. He was written up 3 or more times for assault and battery for attacking fellow inmates. By the time he was transferred to Santa Rosa on March 14, 2012, Rogers had at least 12 inmate assaults on his record during his 10 years in state prison. That's a lot. That's a lot. I'm not going to lie. Just imagine all the ones he didn't get caught for. You got to think. Someone that's been in so many violent situations, that's all he really knows. Just imagine walking into a cell with that guy. You wouldn't have no idea his background or rap sheet, man. You'd be walking right into a nightmare, thinking he's just like your last cellmate, not doing nothing really, just kind of chilling. But in all actuality, this guy's been UFCing it out since he got there. Now, that's a little bit of the background of the 2 inmates we're going to be speaking on today. Let's jump into the incident. What actually happened to Mr. Ricky Martin in a Florida prison cell? Ricky Martin was found lying in a pool of blood on the floor of cell D1-117. His arms were tied behind him and his feet bound together with white strips of cloth. Does this sound familiar? Remember, Rogers did that to Noah, who happened to have been one of his previous cellmates as well, but he didn't take his life. They luckily found Mr. Noah, and he's still living to this day, but Mr. Ricky Martin is not going to have the same ending, unfortunately. A pair of bloody boxer shorts had been slipped over Mr. Martin's head, and another piece of linen was wrapped around his neck. The slight 24-year-old inmate was nearly naked. Bloody handprints smeared on the wall facing the cell door told the story of the brutal death and of the cries for help from him and others on his behalf that went unheard. Mr. Martin was a convicted burglar from Naples who had less than 2 years left on his prison term. Was bludgeoned savagely. His skull was smashed, his face was swollen, bloody, black and blue, and he was cut all over his body. There's no question who fatally beat Martin at the Panhandle Santa Rosa Correctional Institute on March 30th, 2012. It was his cellmate of only a few hours, Sean Jiggaman Rogers, a 6'4", 210-pound inmate with gang ties and a long history of attacking and beating other inmates like we just got done talking about. The questions that haven't been answered, however, by the Florida Department of Corrections are almost disturbing as the grisly way in which Martin died. Who in their right mind decided to put a violent lifer who bragged he had nothing to lose in a cell with a skinny young con serving out his final months? And why didn't correctional officers stop the attack? McKinley Lewis, a spokesperson for the department, said the decision to place the inmates together was made by the prison security and classification officers. Obviously, they don't know how to classify much of anything, do they? Because nobody that is, just got a few months left in his bid should ever be in a cell with someone that has life. Never. You should never do that, man. And there should be a nationwide rule that never allows that to happen. Lewis notes that neither the Florida Department of Law Enforcement nor the DOC inspectors assigned identified any violation of Florida law or department procedures. Of course, it's probably not in there, but it's time to be updated, ain't it? But the FDLE never investigated Martin's death. Gretel Plessinger, a spokeswoman for the FDLE, said that other than technical assistance in the form of lab analysis and evidence collection, the case was handled entirely by the Florida Department of Corrections. In letters to his mother, to a girlfriend, and to the judge, Rogers, the man that killed Mr. Ricky Martin, offered no remorse and said that it was well known by prison officials that he was capable of doing what he did. Just imagine you being a mother getting a letter in the mail from the inmate that killed your son in probably one of the most gruesome ways you could imagine, saying he ain't sorry or nothing, just that he was gonna kill someone sooner or later, but they still decided to put him in my cell. Unreal. I don't even know how this guy got their information to write him a letter to begin with. Maybe he found their addresses in Ricky Martin's property, saved him for later so he could write him a letter. Pretty sick, huh? It's no military secret that I've been one of the most vicious and violent prisoners in the entire state of Florida, Rogers, 34, wrote the judge in his case. He also asked him to be put to death. Based on a Miami Herald investigation, the review of hundreds of pages of court and prison records, including crime scene photographs, the autopsy report, video from the prison's fixed wing, and handheld cameras, and 77 digital recorded audio interviews, shows that Martin was murdered despite his repeated pleas to the Corrections Department Inspector General for protection and later, shortly before he died, to rank and file corrections officers. Some of the inmates who had a direct view into the cell said they told correctional officers that Martin was in trouble and they needed to help him. All 28 inmates said that the officers shrugged the warning, saying some version of "let the next shift handle it." So for 28 inmates to speak on the record about this situation, it speaks volumes, right? They know themselves that this was a fucked up situation. Everything could have been avoided if they would have listened to everybody. Inmate Bell told Senior Inspector Edward White, who was the lead investigator for the Department of Corrections Inspector General's office, everybody told him to get him out of the room. White told Bell that the officer's actions would be addressed, but in fact, no investigation of the guard's actions ever occurred. Florida Department of Corrections conducted just one sworn interview with one corrections officer, and his questioning lasted 9 minutes. Under oath, the officer claimed he looked inside the cell, saw Martin on his bunk, and everything was just fine. Subsequently, an officer, captain, and lieutenant on duty that night were promoted, as well as the warden, Randy Tift. Smells a bit fishy, that's about it. What did this guy do to belong in a cell with this animal? He was a nonviolent offender, said Pat Franklin, a polygraph examiner, private investigator, and a retired police detective. Keep in mind, like I said in the beginning, Mr. Martin was having issues with the guards beforehand, right? He kept trying to do things to keep himself in the side pocket. The whole segregation, he didn't want to go to general population because he was scared of the gangs. Martin was transferred on March 27, 22 to Santa Rosa, one of the state's toughest maximum security prisons. Prison records showed that Martin, who was serving a 6-year sentence for grand theft and armed burglary, had been in Santa Rosa for about 36 months before he was found brain dead. 4 months before the transfer in November 2011, Martin had filed a grievance asking the department's inspector general to place him under protection because his life was being threatened. He claimed that he was being labeled a snitch because he had reported to prison officials that guards at the reception center had been running a fight club in the chow hall. How the hell are you going to have a fight club in a chow hall, man? That's unreal. I can't even imagine that. That institution is completely buck wild if that's the case. Not to mention, though, I have had people on that I've interviewed about certain situations that they've experienced with these fight clubs in prison. So it's something I've definitely heard of, but not in a chow hall. So he's already on a bad note with the COs, man, for pretty much dropping dime on him about the fight club. The corrections officers whose names are in the complaint told me that I was a snitch and told inmates about the incident. Now I have inmates and officers after me. See that? You know, a lot of people don't understand some places and COs can be way more dirtier than the inmates. That's a fact. He also claimed that one of the officers had set him up by planting a knife in his cell. The inspector general denied his petition, his second for protection. DOC officials say Martin was sent to Santa Rosa because he had a long history of disciplinary problems. They say he was a violent offender, having been charged as an adult with armed burglary. Martin's armed burglary arrest, however, involved breaking into a house while the occupant was away, stealing guns and later selling them for $600. Stealing a weapon during a burglary is considered armed burglary, and that is a violent crime. Didn't know that, though. Pretty wild. While in prison, he received 32 disciplinary reports, mostly for cutting himself, tattooing, and disorderly conduct. His only other serious offenses were for a fight and for making spoken threats. As Martin lay in a coma at Sacred Heart Hospital in Pensacola after his beating, Martin was removed from life support and died on April 8th. Miss Nikita says, "They pulled the plug on him. I didn't give them permission. I think the department must have told them to send him back to the prison and he died on the way back. Since medical records are private under federal law, the Miami Herald was unable to confirm who authorized the removal from life support. His father-in-law, however, said that he believes Ricky's fate was sealed by either corrections officers or someone else who had a vendetta against him. My suspicion is they put him in there to teach him a lesson, but I can't prove it." His family acknowledged that Martin was not a model inmate, but the switch of cellmates to Rogers, who towered over the 5'10", 140-pound Martin, set off alarm bells with Martin and several other inmates that day. Now look, the size and weight of an inmate has nothing to do with the situation. It's his background, his rap sheet. If he's serving life, okay, he's never going home, then he should never have been housed with someone that's about to. You could be housed with a 6'9", 300-pound inmate, man. He's about to go home the same time as you. Chances are y'all are going to live in that cell peacefully. Go home together, holding hands. You know, it doesn't matter about the size and weight when it comes down to having a decent cellmate or not. But when it comes down to fighting, protecting yourself, of course, that's why they have weight brackets and all these, physical fighting sports. It does play a big factor, but in this situation, no, it doesn't. Like I said, it's a rap sheet, his background. Despite fears the guards would retaliate against them, 4 inmates separately gave sworn statements that they pleaded with the officers to rescue Martin because he was being raped and beaten by Rogers. Inmate Weldon Holmes, who was housed in D1 116 next to Rogers and Martin just a cell over, said in his sworn interview he heard Martin ask Officer Bwedry, hopefully I pronounced that right, hours earlier to move him away from Rogers. Holmes said that Bwedry told Martin, "Fight or fight," a prison vulgarism that means defend yourself or submit. Holmes is one of at least 4 inmates who reported hearing those same exact words. Imagine asking for help and you hear the CO that's supposed to be helping you say, "Look, buddy, you're going to have to fight or fight." Unreal. And I apologize if the lighting keeps going up and down. It's a cloudy, overcast day, and when the sun comes out, it's out. When it's covered, it's covered. But man, I can't even imagine a situation like this. Holmes, whose interview was omitted from the final inspector general's report posted on the department's website, told investigators he had more information about what happened but was too afraid to reveal everything he knew. He says, I can't go into that because I'm not going to put myself in danger. Sorry, buddy, you're pretty much already there. Mentioning anything against these guards is going to put you at risk. Multiple inmates also told investigators that Rogers liked to sexually assault white inmates. On the day of the beating, Rogers had loudly boasted in the cell block that he wanted to kill a white inmate to avenge racial injustices. Man, oh man, what if homeboy didn't hear any of that before he went into the cell? Everybody in the cell block knew what was going to be happening to old Ricky. Several inmates reported hearing high-pitched screams and thuds coming from the cell, and that Rogers was slapping the stricken cellmate hard on his bare buttocks. Upon realizing what was happening, some inmates shouted for Rogers to stop and put him on the door, meaning just let him go. Give him to the COs, put his stuff packed in front of the door. Rogers apparently pulled back when a CO re-entered the wing at 7 p.m. for a security check. Fixed wing video, which has no audio, shows that at 7:01 p.m. the CO paused outside D1 117 and glanced inside. This dude is fucked up, bleeding, Rogers told the CO. So he just got done beating him and all this, that, and the third, and literally tells on himself to the CO, and still nothing happens. The 6-year veteran correctional officer shrugged it off, according to more than 24 inmates in their sworn taped interviews. At that point, witnesses said Rogers climbed onto his bunk and 10 or 11 times jumped on Martin's head. Finally, the inmates began banging on their cell doors, causing enough commotion to command the attention of corrections officers. At 7:09 p.m., 8 minutes after inmates said they warned guards, a third corrections officer came through, appeared, and walked swiftly to Rogers' cell. He spotted Martin on the floor of his cell covered in his Muslim prayer blanket. Bloody handprints were visible on the wall, and blood was spattered throughout the cell. Mr. Rogers, his cellmate, said that he was fine. He was just cutting himself. Still outside the cell, the CO grabbed a canister of pepper spray, opened the flap, and upon receiving no response from Martin, sprayed the stricken inmate with chemicals. When the cloud cleared and Martin still didn't get up or say anything, officers breached the cell, lifted the blanket, and discovered the inmate bound and battered. Batteries were found strewn across the cell, along with bloody garments and puddles of blood. The murder indictment says that Rogers had put batteries in a sock and used it as a slapjack to hit Mr. Martin until the sock split. Dang, he must have been hitting him real hard, man, for a sock to split. They removed Martin's binds and, despite his condition, placed him in handcuffs and leg restraints before putting him on a stretcher. And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is the terrifying story of Mr. Ricky Martin. He had a rough ride ever since the beginning, down from his parents getting killed all the way to himself being killed in a cell all alone. Rough life, man. And my heart goes out to, his 2 daughters. Just to read an article like that about something happening to your father, it can mess you up forever, man. So, the only thing I can say in this situation, like I already said, sometimes in some places, your worst enemy could be the staff. People should be housed according to their time frame. If they are in violent facilities together, at least try to keep it somewhat similar. He's got 3 years. Okay, there ain't nobody in here with 3 years. So let's put him with this guy. He's got 10. Not with the guy that's got life and had like 30 assaults in the last 10 years. You don't do that. And these stories are terrifying, right? But that's the whole point, is to try to get y'all to see a different light. It ain't just going in there playing some poker, doing your time, and going home in some places. You could just have 5 years and not make it nowadays, man. It's like that sometimes. So if you're on that dark path, man, I strongly suggest you go ahead and reverse it right now before it gets even darker, man. Because you never know. You could be the next Ricky Martin.